Nazi Germany did not lose World War II on the battlefield, it lost it when its fuel tanks ran dry. From the very beginning, Hitler's war machine was built on a dangerous weakness: oil it did not have. Germany had brilliant generals, powerful tanks, and disciplined soldiers, but it lacked the one resource modern war could not survive without. Every panzer, every aircraft, and every truck depended on fuel Germany could barely produce. Unlike the Allies, Germany had no vast oil fields to rely on. Instead, it depended on fragile supply lines, Romanian oil fields, and synthetic fuel factories that were expensive and slow to operate. As long as oil flowed, the German army could move. When oil stopped, the war stopped with it. By 1943, Allied commanders understood this perfectly. They stopped chasing German tanks and started hunting German fuel. Refineries became more valuable than cities. Oil depots became more important than armies. The Allied air campaign shifted its focus from destruction to strangulation. Bombers crossed Europe not to kill soldiers, but to kill mobility. Every bomb dropped on a refinery was a tank that would never move again. Every destroyed fuel plant grounded aircraft before they could take off. Germany tried to adapt. Engineers worked day and night to repair shattered facilities. Synthetic fuel plants were rebuilt again and again, only to be bombed again and again. The Allies were not trying to win quickly. They were trying to make recovery impossible. By 1944, the impact was devastating. German pilots were trained in classrooms instead of cockpits because there was no fuel to fly. Tank crews drilled on maps because engines could not be started. Entire armor divisions existed only on paper. When D-Day came, German reinforcements were delayed not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Trains stood idle. Trucks were abandoned. Panzers were hidden in forests, not for ambush, but because they could not move. Hitler still ordered counterattacks, believing willpower could replace gasoline. Generals planned maneuvers that fuel shortages made impossible. Orders were issued that reality could no longer obey. On paper, Germany still had armies. In reality, it had statues of steel. By the summer of 1944, Allied air superiority made fuel transport suicidal. Tank columns that tried to move during daylight were destroyed from the sky. Those that moved at night ran out of fuel by morning. The battlefield became a trap where movement meant death and stillness meant defeat. Operation after operation failed before it truly began. Not because German soldiers refused to fight, but because engines refused to start. The collapse was silent and unstoppable. No dramatic last stand, no single decisive battle, just a gradual suffocation. By 1945, Germany's once feared army was immobilized. Aircraft sat useless on runways. Tanks were abandoned without firing a shot. The war that had begun with lightning-fast movement ended in total paralysis. Oil had done what no enemy army could. It stopped the Reich in its tracks. World War II proved a brutal lesson. Wars are not won by who has the best weapons. They are won by who can keep them running. Germany lost the war not when its soldiers surrendered, but when its fuel ran out. Because in modern warfare, without oil, even the strongest army is already defeated. By late 1943, Germany was still fighting on every front, but its war was already running on fumes. Allied intelligence no longer measured German strength in divisions, but in fuel reserves. Every successful bombing raid tightened the noose around the Reich's mobility. Synthetic fuel plants became priority targets, glowing on Allied maps like exposed organs. When those plants burned, Germany did not just lose fuel, it lost time it could never recover. Repairs took weeks. Bombers returned in days. This imbalance defined the war. German commanders began rationing fuel as if it were ammunition. Training flights were cancelled. Exercises were reduced to theory. Young pilots graduated without ever flying combat missions. Tank crews memorized procedures they could not practice. The German army was becoming an army in name only. On the Eastern Front, entire armored formations were immobilized by shortages. Vehicles were cannibalized, stripped of parts to keep a few machines running. Movement was no longer tactical. It was selective. Only the most desperate operations were allowed fuel. Every kilometer driven required approval. Every maneuver was a gamble. As Allied bombers dominated the skies, Fuel transport itself became lethal. Rail yards were destroyed. Convoys were hunted from the air. A single typhoon strike could erase an entire fuel shipment in seconds. Germany was not losing fuel slowly. It was bleeding it out. By 1944, the crisis reached its breaking point. German pilots faced Allied aircraft with inferior numbers, less training, and almost no reserves. Losses could not be replaced, not because planes could not be built, but because they could not be flown. The Luftwaffe was dying on the ground. On land, the same paralysis spread. Tanks were hidden in forests, not for ambush, but to save fuel. Counterattacks existed only on paper. Orders demanded movement that reality could not support. When the Allies landed in Normandy, Germany still had tanks. It did not have gasoline. Reinforcements stalled miles from the front. Engines were shut down to conserve what little fuel remained. Entire days passed without movement. The German army watched the war move past it. Commanders spoke of decisive blows. Quartermasters spoke of empty barrels. Between them was a gap no courage could cross. Fuel shortages turned strategy into fantasy. Even when Germany attempted counterattacks, they burned out within hours, not from enemy resistance, from empty tanks. The war that once depended on speed and shock now crawled, stalled, and froze. Germany's greatest advantage, immobility, had vanished. By mid-1944, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The Reich could still fight, it could still kill, but it could no longer maneuver. And in modern war, an army that cannot move is already defeated. The Allies did not need to destroy every tank. They only needed to make sure those tanks could never reach the battlefield. Oil had become the most powerful weapon of the war, and Germany had run out of it. By the beginning of 1945, Nazi Germany was still issuing orders, but its war machine was already dead. Armies existed on maps while fuel depots stood empty. Aircraft were produced but never flown. Tanks were assembled but never moved. The illusion of strength survived longer than the strength itself. Hitler continued to demand offensives, convinced that willpower could replace gasoline. Generals drafted plans that required movement Germany no longer possessed. Reality answered with silence. On the Western Front, German units surrendered intact vehicles simply because they could not retreat. On the Eastern Front, tanks were abandoned without firing a single round. Steel without fuel was nothing more than scrap. The Allied advance no longer faced a mobile enemy. It faced obstacles that could not reposition. The war became a march rather than a fight. Factories still stood, but production no longer meant power. Fuel had become the true currency of victory. The Allies understood this until the very end. They continued bombing refineries even as Germany collapsed, not to win battles, but to prevent recovery. By April 1945, Germany's armed forces were paralyzed. Pilots waited beside aircraft they could not fly. Tank crews guarded machines that could not move. The war had ended mechanically before it ended politically. When surrender finally came, it did not arrive with the final catastrophic battle. It arrived with engines that never started. World War II revealed the truth that would shape every conflict that followed. Modern wars are not decided by who fights harder. They are decided by who can sustain motion. Oil made modern warfare possible, and its absence made defeat inevitable. Germany did not lose because its soldiers lacked courage. It lost because its economy could not feed its machines. The battlefield was only the final stage. The war was decided far from the front lines, in refineries, rail yards, and fuel depots. This was not a story of defeat by firepower, it was a story of defeat by starvation. Because when this fuel runs out, the war is already over.